good. Yes, yes, good. I only have a few minutes. I made some suggestions in my talk as to how we might collectively curate and develop means of drawing from embodied cognitive science and perhaps an active theory in order to scaffold scientific work. Now, no one has the job of this. There's nobody who gets a job as a scientific epistemologist, unfortunately, though we could do with a few. And the motivation for this comes from trying to understand where the terms in which we see ourselves currently come from. That means taking a historical view, and I like the really long historical view that covers like 5 million years. But we can't cover all that. But what we can note is that conditions on planet Earth have changed dramatically over the last few hundred years. In the 19th century, in the middle of the 19th century, Darwin dropped us into the natural order. We could no longer pretend to be demigods. We must understand ourselves as among the living. And we have been confused ever since. We have not got over the shock. In embodied cognitive science, we routinely speak of systems, organisms, animals, and sometimes people, recklessly, thoroughly recklessly, which it just illustrates the confusion. The end of the 19th century saw the fusion of science and technology, something that we seem to be stuck with ever since, that people confuse science and technology, and we now live in a kind of a techno-rationalist world. But the final point I want to pick out in the past is the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, after which the world was completely changed. Since then, we speak of the information age. I don't think it's safe to say that anybody speaks from within a culture anymore. To the extent that we're using academic English, we are necessarily partaking in a global discussion. And this historical perspective is necessary to recognize that science itself grew in a specific cauldron. This is Western Europe with principal currents coming from ancient Greek thought, from Christian figures of thought. And in this cauldron, control became something of a fetish. The notion of control, who controls things? Is it God who controls things? A lot of work has been done to try to make the person responsible for themselves. The person has been collapsed to the body. And I use the figure of Vitruvian Man to drive this home and illustrate how much the single individual body has been constructed within this tradition, with all the theological and political and historical details that accrue to that. I made a simple statement of faith, which was that we are multiply animated. This is the hill I will die on. If you want to look at a body and understand its twitchings, its movements, you will need to appeal to, well, you can appeal to the person, but you will also need to appeal to the sedimentation of years of human engineering and social and cultural practices, and we make no sense without jointly considering that. I made the suggestion that we need to get away from this centering of the body. And I introduced the figure of the soul. I was delighted to see I wasn't alone in introducing the figure of the soul, nor in projecting that onto a jellyfish just to see what that feels like. And it feels pretty good. I recommend trying to see yourself as ensouled and having something in common with a jellyfish and a dung beetle. These various figures. Souls, of course, don't exist. That's not a problem. What the hell exists? Throughout all the discourse of this colloquium, we've seen a coming together of process ontologies, of the codependent origination in Buddhist tradition. We are forced, and I think we all recognize, that we need to acknowledge that things arise in the present, and also that we discourse about things that merely exist. When things arise in the present, nothing can be said to exist, for the present is always, always, always changing. when we speak of things that exist, we've cast them into a domain of discourse. So souls don't exist, but nevertheless, I want to suggest it's a really, really useful term that we've always insisted on in order to recognize each other with respect. And I mean person to person, person to animal, predator to prey. Prey believes in the soul of the predator. Doesn't sit down trying to figure it out. It enters into a relationship with it. So I suggested that one way forward for us, and one way that we as embodied cognitive scientists can do, is to up our game a little bit and recognize that time features in our discourse in different ways. In a physicalist framework, we appeal to chronometric time, and this is the time of modern physical cosmology, but that doesn't tell us about reality. That provides us with a representation of what is real. And what we have learned from that is that there are non-negotiable conditions of being, and that we have bodies, and that whatever sense we're making of the travails of matter and energy, if they don't speak to us as embodied beings, we haven't really learned anything. Time there is chronometric time. When we look at the living and we adopt an organismic frame, we see relation arising. Time arises in relation. This is reflected in so many of the talks here. It's not a question of, oh, today we're going to use an object-oriented ontology, tomorrow we're going to use a process ontology, the next day we're all going to be Buddhists, and then that last day we'll all be cognitive psychologists or something like that. That doesn't work. The organismic frame is special. Here, relation arises, but this is not a frame in which we can construct human society or describe our interpersonal interactions. We can see ourselves as embodied beings. That gives us access to an awful lot. And I suggested the jellyfish, with all its complexity, both the organism in its world and the cell within the organism, as very useful ways of drawing this out. For in the organismic frame, which I believe we have access to since the development of autopoiesis, we can consider an organization, a coherent organization of a self-producing being organized by a single gradient. This seems to be a necessary and a useful formal insight. The third frame I introduced is the one which we're having here now. We dialogue. Nobody has precedence. Nobody gets to say what is and what isn't. Everything is negotiated. I recognize you, you recognize me. This is evocative, and it's always going to be political, and all psychological talk belongs here. The intrusion of scientific psychology into the organismic and even the physicalist framework seems to me to be an obscenity that we need to get rid of. I'm choosing to frame this a little more forcefully, perhaps, than is polite, but there you go. And I introduced a few figures of these: the Vitruvian beetle, which we can see as a thermodynamic entity, an anti-entropic vortex together with his dung, and I think that's a really useful perspective for us. I introduced the jellyfish, and I suggested the monastery as also a human social order organized by a single gradient, in which we can develop a discussion of differentiated human social roles, for example, which will always be with us. So that was what I suggested, and it's basically a contribution to scientific epistemology, recognizing that we are now conducting a global discourse, that we have access to and can draw from all the rich traditions that were represented here, and that we as embodied cognitive scientists have something very serious to contribute to reining in, organizing, scaffolding, and making more rational the employment of science in the conduct of human affairs. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. All right. We do have one question to start with. Rein Raud has a direct question for you, Fred.
Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you very much. I listened to your talk on YouTube, with really great interest, and almost like feeling that, well, I would like to subscribe kind of like under every word you said. I do have a few, though, or like notes or questions, or maybe something that could make up the, or start the, or quick kick launch the discussion. First of all, about the physical time, and you say, well, it goes in seconds and seconds. And I've always wondered how physicalists are speaking about how many years before the planet Earth came into being, millions of years and so on. while a year is the time that it takes for planet Earth to circle around the sun. So millions of years before the planet Earth came into being were not years, but something else. And then at one point, I traced the very interesting history of what the word second means. And originally, it is 1/86,400th of the mean solar day. So again, we have something that is very much bound to the natural circumstances. And finally, well, it's a long story, but finally in 1997, the definition of a second is given as it is the duration of 9,192,631 9,192,631,770 periods of the radiation corresponding to the transition between the two hyperfine levels of the ground state of the cesium-133 atom at the temperature of 0 degrees Kelvin. Thing is, nowhere in the universe has ever been and will ever be a temperature of 0 degrees Kelvin. So it's a completely perspective-bound definition of the time unit, and all the physicists claiming whatever objectivity they want for distances measured in time are basically just like speaking about things that are just as culturally relative like everything else. But what I found very interesting was also your speaking about non-negotiable conditions of being. And actually, I woke up during the night and started thinking about this more. And I think there is a residue of the previous thinking there that we might want to overcome, which separates being from the conditions of being. I would like, if I would like to quote Dogen, my favorite philosopher, he would say, non-negotiable conditions are being, being is non-negotiable conditions, that there is no being outside of these. And when we think of an object or a subject or a being who is outside of these non-negotiable conditions and would like to negotiate them, but cannot because they're non-negotiable, then we kind of end up with an idea of being as being separate from embeddedness. But if I understood, well, this was a part of the first frame. It's just to point out that the first frame of the three is just as illusory or just as perspective bound or just as culturally contingent as the others. And as to these three frames, I don't know if you're familiar with the philosophy of Nishida Kitaro in Japan, but he has a division into three worlds of reality. He says the first world is physical, and in physical world, time can run forwards and backwards because given the circumstances, the same processes can evolve this and that way. The second world is the world of life, because in life, something new emerges, which grows, is the result of processes that cannot go both ways, and the final world is the historical world where life becomes conscious of what is happening and starts to explain it. So I thought this was a sort of a very neat correspondence with these Nishida's ideas.
Thank you very much. I'll start with the last one. Obviously, what I'm trying to do is suggest that we can develop and improve our ways of talking, and that by using these figures, these kinds of self-aware employment of specific discourse frames, we might improve things. So I'm not pushing for any single or overly rigid and strict interpretation of these frames. I think that correspondence with those three divisions is beautiful, very, very apt. I'll notice also that the travails of matter and energy, the embodied being, and the discourse map just as well onto the figures of God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost, which have pervaded Western thinking. So they're, I'm not trying to insist on one way of reading this or another, but I'm trying to suggest that this is a useful way of articulating our discourse. coming back to time, you're absolutely right. Years make no sense once you leave the human social order. Years arise, of course, in the organization of our planet around its fiery, energetic center. The vocabulary of physics is all too often taken to be as a vocabulary of the real, and it is no such thing, and it is an insult to humans to suggest that it is. The Big Bang is not an event. The Big Bang is not a point in history. The Big Bang is a singularity in a mathematical theory, and a singularity is a point at which a theory is mute. I noticed the numbers there, the oscillations in the cesium atom. Physicists love them numbers, and the more numbers there are after the decimal point, the better things are. Whereas psychologists end up spending their life chasing some kind of floppy p less than 0.05 monster. But physicists are 13 figures out into the decimal points. That's what I mean by the non-negotiable conditions of being, and our characterization of the non-negotiable conditions of being should not see us entombing ourselves in a carapace or restricting ourselves in any way, because we can always probe these further. And furthermore, what we're doing as we do so is finding out what we can do under these conditions. I like to think, because we're speaking of the frame in which I've cast a dung beetle, I like to think of a happy dung beetle doing a dance to the sun god. I'm not suggesting that particularly as a scientific contribution, but this is the way that these figures can be developed. There's no reason for us, I mean, we can object to matter. You're not going to get very far objecting to matter. You can hit your head off a wall only so long. But given that there's a wall there, you can then decorate it, climb it, extend it, live in its shadow. To recognize non-negotiable conditions of being is simply, as it were, to find out what the dance is that you're dancing. And in the organismic frame now, where we see relation, dance metaphors become perhaps more useful. Notice how many of our discourses always revolve around trying to bring together the present and this discourse of existence. This is Heraclitus versus Parmenides. Parmenides lays out being with no change. Heraclitus is all presentist. And just like the figures of God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, we shouldn't just associate this with two particular pre-Socratic philosophers. We should be aware that everyone has faced this. This is a recurring theme and will never go away. While souls don't exist, minds don't exist either. Nobody has ever been able to find a mind any more than they have a soul. We've got extended, distributed, enacted, individual, non-individual minds. So minds suffer from the same sort of problem as souls do, but minds are one way of dealing with this temporal discourse by stuffing everything in absolutely implausibly into brains, including your personal history, the ghastly notion of the specious psychological present. Minds have been used to collapse these temporal questions, which don't go anywhere. These are conditions of being. We live with these questions. I just find myself in agreement, and I think there's so much fun to develop these figures. Thank you.
Lovely dialogue. We've got another question in the queue, and that is from Daniel Maddox.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk this morning and also the video. I'm really interested in sort of how your different frameworks and how your way of talking about different kinds of beings, how that maps onto something like value theory or political philosophy, because it seems like there's going to be a lot of ramifications, right? So, if we think of the sort of classic image that you represent with Winnie the Pooh trapped in half, right? The ethics has been, since the Enlightenment, this idea of, well, what happens with the head part of Winnie the Pooh? What does that tell us about value? What does that tell us about the right and the good and the evil and all that sort of stuff? But once you move away from that and you start talking about Winnie the Pooh as a whole, or Winnie the Pooh in his environment with all of his friends and whatnot, you really have to start changing your ethical picture. And I'm especially interested in how this might intersect with your discussion of beings or humans or whatever, animals being multiply animated. So I thought that idea was especially salient to me, and it seems like that's going to put a lot of pressure on sort of this traditional, like, abstract rule-based discourse of ethics.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, I've been wondering about all those things myself. And clearly, when I suggest here's some figures to play with, I'm not going to be making a strong contribution to contemporary political scientific debate, for example. By querying the sovereign along with the usual dualities of nature and culture and the social, and by social, I mean you construct the person in one way, you end up with a given view of what the social is. So those are completely interdependent. Querying all four at once can't really be done, but we've been doing it all along anyway. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, which was born in the religious wars of Europe, was one attempt, desperate attempt, to come to grips with this, to grant the temporal sovereign complete authority in order to organize things. Now, coming back to ethics and such questions, I do have a view here, but I don't know if it's of any use. Ethics, for me, arises in interaction and mutual recognition. And we will try to codify ethics, and we will always be writing and rewriting our rules of ethics. And just because we're good people and we want to get along with each other, ethics is Fürsorge, caring, soteriology. Morality is completely different. And this has been confused forever. When you see people getting outraged, there's always something they're not willing to give up. There's always some background organizing gradient, which can neither be brought forth and made manifest, nor can be relinquished. And this is the origin of all religious wars. When you look at, for example, the current divide between the Republicans and the sane people in the United States of America, you see two groups, each of whom are clinging to something which they will not give up, which ends up with them not even recognizing each other as people. So this organismic frame with its single gradient, organization by a single gradient, provides a new way of thinking about this. I mean, I'm certainly not a Kantian, and I don't believe that morality can ever be made explicit. But what we can do is recognize that we are all organized by gradients, many gradients, but viewed when we become aware of a single overarching gradient that frames an organization, that's something that can neither be made explicit nor can be given up. So I think these figures are useful for this. They point out that everything we do is political because we're always discussing in the vocative, but we can make use of the idea of what does a single gradient organization give you? And this elaboration of the single gradient, incidentally, places my position of within the inactive world somewhat at odds with some of the proposals that have been made, specifically the introduction of adaptivity, which is necessary in order to develop a picture of a dung beetle or of a jellyfish or of any specific animal. I've held off on that because I think autopoiesis is the thing that gives us the idea of a single overarching gradient, precisely because we have a self-producing being. And I think that's such a valuable insight that we need to sort of preserve it and treat it carefully. So there's some thoughts on that.
Thank you for that. We do have another question. Tony?
Hey, Tony, you're mute.
No, I'm not. I'm not muted anymore. So, Fred, you know, as I was listening to your video and the talk that you gave now, I keep losing where the Fred Cummins life work of joint speech fits into the picture that you're developing for us. And I guess I would like to invite you to comment on that.
Oh, thank you. I didn't really mention it. Yeah, I've been wondering that myself. I started in my PhD, I started studying speech rhythm, in which I looked at the organization. I used a chronometric view of time and tried to find where people place stresses, rhythms, beats, emphasis, dance steps, where the body aligns with clocks. After my PhD, I realized bodies align with bodies so much better than bodies aligning with clocks. And what they do together is not describable in the chronometric time frame. And so I ended up warring with all my former colleagues who were insisting on using oscillator and physical models, all of which reduced to, here's an oscillator, and we'll refer everything back to the oscillator. The oscillator for me has absolutely zero content, and it's the writhing and twining of the bodies that we need to pay attention to when we're looking at. So that brought me to joint speech, which is people speaking together. And when you look at joint speech and you are suitably skeptical of contemporary accounts of mind, you see enormous things. So the manner in which we transiently assemble under a single gradient, a group of school children bullying a kid in the school ground, if you want to get away from virtuous applications, you get a group of kids organized going, yeah, 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 taunting someone in the middle. This is power. This is organized. They act as one. They form a coherent whole. And it's not a coherent whole in any domain of existence. It's one that has to be refreshed, has to be brought into being. And so this has got me away from psychological models into the world of ritual and religion. And it just makes an awful lot more sense that way. Now, the religion word is a filthy word in a contemporary context. We have completely messed up any discussion of this. As I said, every embodied being, my religion is the religion of the embodied being. I have a body. I find myself coming into being right here, right now. I just got here. Where did I come from? Well, there's a life story, an individual one. There's my ancestry. There's the history of life. I got here through very, very many paths, and I find myself trying to make sense of things from my couch right now. That requires a re-engagement with the tools of science, because all along I've been doing science grounded in observation, employing the methods and mathematical models that are available. But I've got very far away from what I've just called sort of the techno-rationalist mode of discourse, which seems to be so popular. I'm in the computer science department. We'll shut up about that. So that's roughly it, Tony.
Did that satisfy you? I have one question if Tony does not have further questions. Would you care, you used the term dialogical realism, and I was wondering if you'd say a little bit more about it. Like, do you have a very specific definition in mind, and how does it relate to the Vitruvian models that you introduced in your talk?
Right, great question, thank you. I was speaking a few years ago at a meeting, and one of my colleagues, another cognitive scientist, was clearly not on board with the picture I was presenting. There was some assumptions there that were not acceptable. I don't know what it was, but she asked me afterwards, she said, and what would you say to us realists? And I was a bit gobsmacked. I mean, you can look up in a book and go to Webster's to find a definition of realism, but really that's throwing down the gauntlet, isn't it? To be an honest interlocutor is to be a realist. There's no other way to conduct a conversation. You can't lie in chant, by the way. There's one interesting speech act that's not possible in chant. So we're all realists, and for someone to say, yeah, that's fine, but what about us realists, struck me as particularly provocative. So I distinguished between science with a capital S as a beacon of pure truth, which is the way it's often presented. And then I suggested dialogical realism towards joint actionable consensus, which marries this notion of the vocative together with the awareness that what we're doing will have consequences for the world and is inherently political, and there's no way around that. And this is the ethical thing. So ethical discourse is always intersubjective. It is never pronouncements. Like, I'd love to be Pope, but until the day that I'm Pope, all my discourse will be in the vocative. So yeah, it's a bit clunky. But when you have science with a capital S as a beacon of truth, it's easy to lampoon and ridicule that model because science is just so messy and multifaceted and draws on all kinds of things. You realize what science doesn't offer because it's been treated there as a wisdom tradition. People are told we must believe in science, and people have hope for science. We want a vaccine because vaccination is the one thing that science did right. Science has done two things so far. It's done the atomic bomb and it's done smallpox vaccination. Well, okay, there was a few more, but those two are worth always considering together. And as we hold out hope for the vaccine, you see that science should be in a position to provide us with hope, and it has no vocabulary for doing that. I tried to point to that in my talk, but this is a very poorly articulated discourse. I don't know anyone who has managed to make this point properly, but that distinction between dialogue, shall we say, ethical discourse and pronouncement, though that's the distinction I'm trying to draw out. Yeah. I do find it interesting that we treat journal articles as scripture, incidentally, for people who are supposedly horrified by the notion of religion. Once it's been through the obviously truth-generating process of peer review and there's letters on a page, now we have scripture. We've never got away from our traditions, and we never will. We can develop them.
These are very interesting points. Let's consider them for the open discussion. Is it all right, Mark McGann, if I ask you to write down your question so that we can move on to our next speaker? All right, give me 1 second. So, Abeba Birhane is a cognitive science PhD candidate at the Complex Software Lab at University College Dublin, Ireland. Her interdisciplinary research aims to connect the dots between complex adaptive systems, machine learning, and critical race studies. More specifically, Birhane studies how machine prediction, especially of social outcomes, is dubious and potentially harmful to vulnerable and marginalized communities. All right, take it away, please.
Thank you so much. So nice to hear Fred again. We used to have so many of these chats and we haven't in a while. Yeah, and it's also really nice to see so many familiar faces. So I should confess, I am not, I've left, I'm less and less of a cognitive scientist these days because I find myself in my work among what Fred earlier called the techno-rationalists. So my work has become more and more of a pushback against that techno-rationalist worldview as opposed to thinking or writing about embodied cognitive science or the inactive perspective. Anyway, having said that, I still I still lean a lot on, approach to cognitive science. So I will perhaps summarize with a couple of examples. I'll summarize the talk that was on YouTube. So it's when we are so deep and immersed in these really deep questions of being and the conditions of being and mind and souls, the world goes on, and this view, I'm going to stick to the techno-rationalist terminology because I really like it and it really captures what I'm also trying to describe. So the techno-rationalist view goes on not just only as an academic endeavor or a point for discussion, a point for debate, or a matter for theorizing, but rather in a way that is creating what it means to be, and in a manner that also impacts the future that we are inheriting. So to make this a little bit more, to bring this alive, what I'm talking about is the various machine learning systems that are really ubiquitously embedded in every aspect of life. Even looking at this Zoom call, we have a system that change voice to text, that changes my voice into text. So it really is everywhere. We have machine learning systems in banking, in hiring, in education, even in assessing social welfare systems, who is qualified, who is worthy of social welfare, and so on. And so these questions are not new, obviously, even though the rise of deep learning has only, it has come to prominent over the last 10 years. But one point one point to point out is, so if you take self-driving cars, for example, the moral question, the trolley problem, the moral dilemma has always been there. We've questioned, if the current version of the trolley problem, which is self-driving cars, if a self-driving car is going AWOL on the road, should it be programmed to save the driver or the people on the road? These are questions that we have asked, that we have contemplated about. But when these systems are actually programmed and when they are becoming part of everyday life, what we see in reality is somewhat different. And in a recent work, for example, as opposed to these questions that we have contemplated, who should be spared, what we find is that the computer vision systems that are implemented on self-driving cars actually have raised rather different questions, because the way computer vision systems are conceptualized, the way they are developed, the way they are implemented, what they found in this recent study is that the darker a person's skin, the less accurately the person is recognized on the street to begin with. So it became a matter of a question of who is seen as a person, who is seen more of as a person and less of as a person. So with this example, what I want to point out is that we all vie with the embodied perspectives, the inactive approaches that we exist in a web of relations. We are inherently embodied, ambiguous, always situated in context. All that comes without question. But for all that consensus, at least in the context of this meeting, given the people here, what we find out there in the techno-rationalist world, which is driven by big tech, which I also admit I am currently part of to some extent. Well, my friends call me somewhat a sellout, but I'm a good type of sellout. So the point I'm trying to make is, so what, despite all these, consensus agreements that, the person is, unpredictable, always in a web of relations and contextual, and not something that can be understood once and for all, that can be finalized. What we find is the likes of Google, Facebook, Microsoft, through the predictive systems, through various algorithms that are being integrated in the social world. What we find is that the techno-rationalist view is actually what's ruling the world, and what is also having a concrete impact on individual people and on groups. And this impact becomes even much more hard-felt when the individuals and groups that are in question are somewhat at the margins of society. Again, as we all know, what's normal, what's a standard is never separated from the person that is constructing or giving us the view of the normality. So as these systems are developed, those that are kind of characterizing and developing normal behavior or higher level person, or a trustworthy person, becomes the view of those, especially usually elite white men that are behind the construction and the development of these missions. So due to that, anything outside that, any person outside that status quo feels the burden and the harm much more concretely. And so this is where I'm currently. So I'm a PhD student, even though I'm on a panel with professors here. So these are the questions I'm currently battling with, and for people here, it's very obvious that the idea of categorizing people and having a final answer of various characteristics of human beings is obviously a futile project, but not so much within the techno-rationalists, within the world of techno-rationalism. And what I'm trying to do is, so full disclosure, I'm currently interning with DeepMind, which is part of Alphabet. So I work with a lot of engineers who are actually developing various systems that are actually deployed into the world. So what I'm currently trying to do is trying to point towards these views of complex systems thinking in action and embodied coxi to have some concrete some concrete material to say, here is why finalizing the person or making predictions is problematic, and here is how it can be harmful to certain groups and certain individuals. So that is me trying to contextualize my work in my current context. Yeah, if you have questions, shoot them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. So we're going to do the thing where we allow people to maybe think for a second about what question they want to ask, because this is a very relevant topic. And please type, I have a question in the chat when you have sort of percolated enough to feel confident in articulating it. Great, we already have a queue. Let's start with Daniel Maddox.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm going to ask maybe a bit of a bizarre question, but do you think that part of how we imagine our relationship with technology, you think part of that is dependent on the sorts of arts we produce about human technology interactions? So I'm really interested in how fictions about, science fiction, like if you go back to like Neuromancer or something like that, right? Like when we start to conceive of the relationship between humans and machines, we start with that as an imaginary, right? We construct possibility spaces. And then as we develop these research programs, how are those things guided by what we've already decided technology should be like, what we already decided our relationship to technology should be? So do you think that, maybe part of where this intervention needs to happen isn't just at the level of people engineering right now, but when people start talking about like these imaginary futures or these imaginary ways that we can develop technologies and connect ourselves to each other and that sort of thing, do you think that we need to shift our consciousness at the like cultural level of like producing fictions and things like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And of course, we have to break down what we mean by we. And speaking from, a position of someone who is inside the corporate world, and speaking from the corporate we, no, we build systems. The engineers, the scientists are. It's not. People don't build based on what future scenarios they have imagined, but rather much of the development, much of the tech that exists is driven by a lot of corporate motivations. Much of it comes down to what makes the most money, and how do we maximize profit. And unfortunately, it really is driven by the business model of a certain corporate, and it's not. It's not. And some of you probably have seen the recent problem with Google's ethical AI, where the two leads of the program were fired within a couple of months apart. And when you dig down under that, what you find is, on the one hand, you have these two really strong women that have produced so much intellectual work that really have moved the field, kind of saying we have to be driven by what is less harmful to minoritized communities, we have to be driven by what is good for the environment. So the paper that got Dr. Timnit Gebru fired was a paper pointing out that large language models are disastrous for the environment. And so any kind of aspiration for somewhat equitable and good, whatever that means, future, as long as it doesn't align with certain business models, it does not survive. So my cynical view is that it really is driven by profit.
Thank you. Thank you for that question and that answer. We move now to Elena Kufari.
Hi, thanks. Thanks so much, Abeba, for a wonderful talk. You were sort of just speaking to the question I was about to ask, so maybe I just invite you to continue. So last year, I was at an event that Sebastian Lerick put together on diversity computing, humane computing, the dynamic medium, dynamic land, and I was learning all these fascinating things, and I met Jelle van Dijk, who I know you've worked with, and it seems like your critique is so apt, so powerful, and so clear. And it seems like there are answers. There are answers, there's alternative models, there's this possibility. Yeah. And it also seems like, thinking about Shoshana Zuboff's work and what you were just saying, that because capitalism wants us to be predictable, the alternatives don't have a chance, right? They want us to be predictable. They want engagement for the sake of engagement. And we, according to Zuboff's book, like, this ship has sailed years ago. Google has way too much power. Facebook has like an elite board that's now making a shadow government level decisions about what Trump can do. Like, what the heck? Where and how can we bring in the work that you're doing? So I'm really curious, as you're now working on the inside, and based on what you just said in response to Daniel, like, where's the hope for these other models?
Thank you. So first of all, I'm a big fan of your work. So it's really nice to meet you here. And yeah, I love your work. And that diversity computing paper, I'm citing it like everywhere, because I see it as one of the one possible way forward with a different type of computing, one that embraces differences rather than tries to, put people in boxes. One that embraces like ambiguities, one that is open-ended, one that is that supports interconnectedness. So, but I had an email exchange with Marek, who is here, about this. But because automation and machine learning systems are inherently systems that need completion, if you want to automate something, you have to have, it cannot be open-ended. You have to have a start and an end. But that stands against, if against what it means to be human, as as long as we can define humanness. So does that alternative vision, a different type of computing that embraces these diversities or ambiguities and open-endedness, is that possible? Or if that is even possible, does that become something entirely different as opposed to a computer system? So yeah, I'm just bouncing the question back to you and everybody, because I don't have an answer, and I don't think anybody. Yeah, I don't know. I'm open to listening anyway.
Thank you. Lena, would you like to respond or ask a further question from that?
No, thank you. I mean, it's just more to discuss. I hope we can keep having the conversation.
All right. Then we'll move on to Fotis Tsirukis.
Yeah. First of all, this was an extremely relevant issue, a really good presentation, and more people should be addressing these issues, I think. And well, my worry is, how do we address the working data scientists? What is knowing all this? How do we construct a course of action through whatever means, through institutional means, through whatever means we can, to actually address the people that are working on it and don't actually care about them that much, and the designers that kind of care, but they have their own incentives that are, as we said, more neoliberally, capitalistically driven. So do you have a proposal yourself, or anybody else who might know what we do?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, again, so there are various approaches that various people are taking. So one is, a lot of people have been saying that we need, very strict, tight regulations. So it's a matter of, negotiation and, for between politicians and tech corporations and various startups and various AI companies that are, creating and selling these systems. So that's one rule, and these are really not my expertise, but I'm just listing, the various proposed options. And so for example, in Europe, GDPR to some extent has been laying out, all kind of, the grounds as to what should and shouldn't be done, and what rights individuals have towards their data, and how it's processed, and predictive systems that affects them and all that. Another is people have been advocating for, coalition and co-organization. There is a group of ex-Google employees, for example, that are organizing, that are unionizing, as a way to kind of, combat or push back against these big tech giants. Another is, even within the machine learning community, even within these big tech companies like the likes of Google and DeepMind, you do have engineers and scientists that are organized, that are trying to do, some kind of academic work in making these systems that already exist, not advocating that they be thrown out, but making them better, making them fairer, making them more equitable. yeah, and another is, like I mentioned earlier, along the lines of what Elena and Van Dijk and Dieger and others suggested, envisioning a different kind of technology, although in my view that remains more of a theoretical proposal rather than something actionable. Not that theoretical proposals aren't as important. So yeah, there are various movements and various organizations, but even having said that, I still feel so. I still feel very cynical. So in the most impactful, in the most economically, I can't remember the exact terminology. The most impactful organizations, we used to have, pharmaceutical companies, automobile companies, all that. But over the last few years, the big 5 technologies have taken over. They are the richest, the most powerful: Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft, I think. So given that they are becoming more and more powerful, even with all these various movements in organizations, I don't feel a lot of optimism. I'm sorry yeah.
Thank you for that very informative, if that's a hopeful answer. We have another question on the queue.
Can I respond?
Sure, of course, Paula.
Yeah, it seems that not many people are really optimistic this time around. And it seems impossible to regulate Google. I mean, you can take Facebook to court, but it's really hard to take Google to court. And organization can only do so much. But the last proposal the last option you said about constructing alternative technology seems much more promising. And I'm asking, I don't know if we have time, but I'm thinking of there are now some advancements in decentralized media, in decentralized technology. It started from crypto economic talk and technologies, and it goes to various. I mean, I see platforms for streaming and social media that are completely decentralized, without this control of data. They're still startups, but do you see some future in that at least?
Yeah, let's be optimistic and say, yeah, there is.
All right. Next question, turning it back to Tony.
Hi, that was great. Let me just talk a little bit very briefly about my own life. When I was an undergraduate learning to program, what we focused on was the syntax and where do the semicolons go, and what kind of brackets you use in what kind of situation. And then when I was in my PhD program, I learned programming a dramatically different way, right? This is, I think, kind of like a revolution in computer science education, where people stopped focusing on languages and started focusing on what they called computational thinking, right? Which is, computational thinking is basically, reductionism. Let's look at this very complicated thing we want to get done, and let's make it into a bunch of little tiny things that are easy to accomplish. And if these tiny things add up in just the right way, then you get the software that you want, or the outcome that you want. And I mean, again, this is just straight from Descartes' Discourse on a Method. This is just how reductionist science is done. I mean, and I guess the question I want to ask of you, Abby, is that is the kind of education in computational thinking that everyone gets now when they learn to program, which they do before they go work for Google or whoever, is that like necessarily techno-rationalist, right? Is there another way to think about computer science education that won't make people treat people as collections of parts?
Yeah, that's a huge question, Tony. And I'm definitely out of my breaths to answer that, but I'll attempt anyway. I guess it goes back to, you know, the capitalist incentives of how not only computer science, you know, the whole field is, you know, the whole ecology is, you know, constructed, and it might be possible to do it a different way, and this is, if again, this is Elena and Dieger and Jelle van Dijk and others have in a sense proposed, but this is almost a complete shift in everything, in the whole environment, in how we think, in what we prioritize, and it requires the political will. To some extent, maybe this is what the Google AI team attempted, and they got fired because they were trying to create a different kind of culture. Yeah, sorry, I'm not answering your question well, but I get your question, and yeah, I see it as a big challenge, and yeah, that's my response.
I guess so. This is just that, you know, optimism versus pessimism. What I'm concerned about is whether it is possible to be a good programmer and not be a reductionist, right? And I'm not sure that that's true. You know, Fred graduates PhDs in computer science who don't actually program, right? So maybe that's the kind of future that we're looking at. I don't know that.
Fred, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to say a little word to that. I do run a large master's program in computer science as well, so I get to see what the concerns of my colleagues who run computer science degrees are, and to compare approaches across universities and across countries. And there's been a worrying trend recently of setting up degrees that are very, very close to industry, that amount to nothing more than glorified internships where the syllabus is shaped purely by industrial concerns. And I'd just like to point out, I speak from a position of privilege as a professor, but rather than just providing me with cocktails and Lamborghinis, the university is much older than the nation state. The university has played a role as a place where ideas can be curated, dangerous ideas can be curated, and where a certain form of wisdom has been enacted over many, many hundreds of years. The manner in which we teach computer science, programming, we can design all kinds of things. We can put together the best possible curricula. Most people in the university are motivated to do that. This is one of those cases where it's necessary to shield your eyes from the sun of the economy and the funding pressures, because they tend to try to marshal the unruly forces of academia to industry goals. I rather like being in a university, I must say, and try wherever possible to push back against that. So don't neglect the role of the university in all this. It's a big ecosystem.
Well, thank you. This is a very interesting discussion on the tensions of technology and bigger things, more important things. We can perhaps return to this in the open discussion. Right now, I would like to move on and introduce our third panelist for the day. 1 second. Rein Raud is a research professor at the School of Humanities at Tallinn University. He is currently developing discourses of selfhood and subjectivity toward an engagement with social ontology. In parallel, he is looking at mechanisms of sociocultural change, particularly in the context of cultural conflicts and social diversity. Dr. Raud's work has been influenced by Japanese philosophy and especially the works of the Zen Buddhist Dogen. I turn it over to you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, let me thank you for organizing this. This is an excellent session, and I have learned quite a lot already, also from watching these talks. It's an honor to be here, and I hope this well, you obviously seem all to be already collaborating on a number of things, but I hope to be able to do something together with some of you also in the future. So a few words about what I said. I was well, Abeba was talking about very, hands-on things, and how all of this relates to ongoing processes of or ongoing struggles and power and so on. And I was a little bit, slightly amazed that so many questions were asking her to predict things, while she stated in her talk that humans are unpredictable, and therefore predictions are actually like not doing justice to what the human self is. This is also one of my main points. I was trying to sketch a kind of a process ontology. Well, lots of people are talking about the need for a more elaborate process philosophy and so on, and you hear it from Rosi Braidotti, from quite a few other people. But when you start looking at what is called process philosophy, then somehow these processes very quickly get reified into things. Well, take Nicholas Rescher, for example. He says, well, there are such and such kinds of processes. Processes have such and such properties, and we should be able to, look at them from this and that angle. Well, this is precisely the point of a process ontology, that we don't reify, and we recognize that what we call things are actually already reifications. They are what I call entifications. They are made from some certain perspective. We have a kind of a cognitive apparatus that discloses the world to us in a certain way. And people who call themselves realists very often say that, but there was in an article I read recently, there was this, well, I am a realist. I believe that the world exists and the things in it do too. The world exists fine, but when we come to the things in it, that they exist of their own right, we are already reifying. We are already assigning something that looks to our cognitive apparatus as a thing, something that it is a thing. Someone who exists more quickly or more slowly than us in an Uexküllian Umwelt may not notice something that we perceive to be a distinct thing. Well, we think that mountains are very stable and nothing, happens. But when we take the life range of the lifetime of a mountain range, a couple of 100,000 years, and we squeeze it into the time frame of a human life, we see that the mountains are, moving pretty quickly, actually. And from the mountains' point of view, we don't exist. We are like, radio waves. We are like signals between two mobile phones. Because we pass so quickly that we are impossible to notice. And this kind of perspectivism, I think, provides us with a sort of healthy skepticism that we would not call realist somebody who imputes structures constructed fully in the mind onto what reality is by itself, mind independently, gaze independently. Well, that's one of my main points. And what I was arguing is that this kind of process ontology, first of all, accords better with what we know about the more recent picture of the world of natural sciences, like quantum physics and all that. It is always a little bit suspicious when the humanist starts quoting, from quantum physicists and so on. But not to worry, I have a slight chapter in my forthcoming book, but I also know a very good quantum physicist who was kind enough to read it and say, yes, this is exactly how it is, and it has been translated into humanist or human language rather correctly. Secondly, I wanted to transpose this process ontology onto selfhood. When we look at human selves or persons, personalities, I agree with Fred that it is impossible to define what a person is, and that there are loads of ways how this can be done, and that we should be very careful. But to think of first of all, a person as a site or not a site or like a site of intersection of multiple heterogeneous processes. We could call those biological processes of the body. We could call them mental processes. We could call them cultural processes, because when I learn, when I read books, the information traverses through myself, the same intersection, and then when things happen at this intersection. I remember, for example, that when I first read a novel of Anatole France, I had a toothache. So now, anytime when I'm thinking of Anatole France and reading that or something by him, I have this sort of uncomfortable feeling that something is wrong. So these two absolutely unconnected processes have merged into a sort of a trace in me, and I think this is how we all are. And when we think of a person, it is, in my mind, much more appropriate not to speak of anyone really, but in particular a human being, as someone who is self-identical and who is continuous. I think we should look at ourselves as maybe cross-sections of these multiple intersecting processes. A cross-section, a field, which is a field of tensions. These different elements on that field of tension, they hold each other in check. Well, each of these would like to have control. For example, let's say there is a tedious meeting, and I would like to have a coffee. I would also like to smash this speaker's head. I would like to have an agenda that I have to push through this and so on. So I have these multiple things and multiple urges, and then maybe well, I'm hungry or whatever. All these impulses, they come together and they all like dictate. We'll say, now do this and now do that. And well, obviously something at the intersection happens, and something I also do. But it's not that there is a center, a rational point in the mind which says, now you speak, now you speak. Well, there is no moderator always going on. This leads to some fairly uncomfortable consequences, because for example, when after a party in the morning, somebody comes and apologizes, says, well, yesterday, please never mind yesterday, it wasn't me, it was the booze speaking, right? Point is, the booze was you at that moment when it was speaking. It was this sort of material process had taken control of who you are and had made you speak in a particular way. So there is no me outside of where you know, different intersections meet. And from here, I'm advancing this toward a kind of like a radicalized version of group theory. There are several people who are dealing with social ontology at the moment who are saying that, yes, actually we can assign something like consciousness or some aspects of consciousness to a group, while obviously really consciousness is something that only takes place in ontological individuals, that consciousness is something that is tied to the brain, and therefore groups really don't think. And if we say, well, the board has this opinion, or that the government has decided, it is actually single people who have decided, they have just like done that together and so on. I don't think this is the correct approach. I think that we should credit groups and collectives with precisely the same kind of fieldness as is appropriate for single individuals. It's just that the group needs these particular individuals to mediate their own heterogeneous processes into a sort of a shared field, and then we have the result that that the groups may think and they may have emergent properties or emergent capacities that none of the single people have, or someone among those single people who is maybe the boldest can make all the other people also bold. Some single person can make all the other persons see things differently because they say, okay, yes, well, we're going to look at this from your perspective. And remember, everything exists as it is seen from someone's perspective. So groups act as fields, just as single people do. And I believe this process ontology, connected to extended mind theories, embedded cognition theories, and so on, has much more explanatory power than the traditional object-oriented ontologies do. Well, I will stop here. Thank you.
Jonathan, is that you in the queue? All right.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Raud. I always enjoy listening to your talks. Having known a little bit about your background, I wanted to ask if I'm not detecting some of Nishida Kitaro whenever you talk about the relational person as a field. And I wonder if that's sort of a non-dualist perspective. Are you incorporating this sort of non-dualist perspective, which is not merely that, you know, humans are just groups and then there's something else, but rather there's kind of an interplay between I'm still Jonathan, but I'm also a part of this group. And there's that tension that you were talking about. I just wanted to make that explicit. Am I detecting that correctly, or am I just projecting from my own reading?
Well, as usual, yes and no. In that there are certain affinities with Nishida, but I think Nishida, when he speaks about a place or locality and so on, he's speaking about something that is outside. He's speaking about a sort of a social space or a whatever space wherein individuals, by relating to each other, create them each other mutually, and also become what they are. While for me, the field is a cross-section of the processes that I already am. It is what Freud's non-negotiable conditions of being have brought me to be. Well, a certain influence of Buddhist philosophy is of course there, because the Buddhist idea of no self, or seeing the self as well, you know, well, you probably do, but maybe not everybody does. There is the very famous dialogue in one of the early Pali Buddhist texts, the Questions of Menander, which is a really nice example of early East-West encounters. Menander was a king of a small Indian kingdom in the northwest, where Alexander the Macedonian, Alexander the Great, had done a little bit of conquering, and when he retreated, there were certain Greek kingdoms which were in existence for a little bit of time. And this Menander, who is a historical person, and there are actually coins with his face, he was interested in this new intellectual trend called Buddhism, and he asked a Buddhist monk to come there and to explain, well, what is this no self nonsense and so on. So the monk called Nagasena said, well, sir, you have probably arrived here not on foot. Correct. You have come here on a carriage, right? I said, yes, exactly. So where is this carriage? This carriage consists of wheels, the axle, the whatever, the box, and so on. Is the box the carriage? No. Wheels? No. Axle? No. So imagine now that we have a heap where there is this box, these axles, wheels, and so is this the carriage? No. So what is the carriage? The carriage is the pattern according to which all these things have been put together. So me, am also the way in which different streams of being, my body, my memories, my ideas, my desires are being put together. And it is still possible to think of this person as something self-identical and continuous in time. What I would like to argue is that this is not quite so, because, well, our body cells change into other body cells several times over during our lives. We had some ideas in childhood, some in adolescence. We have some quite different ideas now. So this pattern of what we are is in kind of a constant movement. Each point to it on it maybe has traces or its history and so on, something more, but there is no stable self-identical pattern even. Therefore, the field is in constant movement. So there is a dialogue with Buddhist and Japanese philosophy, but it's not strictly Buddhist and Japanese philosophy that I would like to translate into some kind of a Western idiom.
Thank you. Fred Cummins also has a question.
Yeah, Rein, thank you so much. Process ontologies are always a little hard to introduce into most forms of contemporary scientific discourse and technological discourse. But I'd like to come back and pick up on your statement about alcohol. It's not me, it's the booze talking. Soulwax, that wonderful Belgian DJ couple, had a song called It's Not Me, It's the E Talking. I don't know if you've ever done ecstasy, but there's a chance that if you do, you will walk around hugging people and saying, I love you, man. The organismic frame I'm suggesting allows us to reconsider somewhat the relationship we have with substances, substance now in the broadest general sense. And I think various forms of discourse that are appearing as in a neo-materialist frame are of use here. So in a neo-materialist frame, we might observe that humans have always interacted with the chemicals of the world around them to the extent that they are inextricable from the chemicals of the world around them. And this applies just as much to your virtuous oat flakes that make your porridge as it does to ecstasy or alcohol or anything like that. This kind of neo-materialist framework then, which I'm suggesting it sits fairly easily in the organic frame that I'm talking about, allows us then also to consider, for example, texts as material things, as incarnate material things. So to ask, where are the books? What was the effect of introducing steam printing in the Victorian age, for example, on the dissemination of ideas? It is possible to inquire into our textual heritage without leaning on the notion, the problematic and psychological notion of reading, for example, simply to look at the distribution of texts, to look at their physical manifestations, who had access to them, what were the monasteries all about, what are the universities about. I noticed the peculiar role of the journal as scripture these days, for example. These are ways to interrogate texts without asking anything about how people read them, because reading is a psychological notion. I wonder, when you said, yes, it was you talking, just you don't get out of that. Well, that you is problematic for me. I'm unhappy with the idea that it was you talking, because that means you, the person who bears full responsibility for your actions, who will have to answer for the damage that you did last night while you were out on a bender. That's a morally constructed, responsible person. Of course, you are that too. But who's speaking when you're boozed up? Well, isn't it also the alcohol speaking? Isn't it also the long history of humans and their social orders with the substances of various kinds that they deal with?
Well, of course, clearly. But when you say it was not me, it was the booze talking, you are dividing or separating the booze from yourself and saying, well, I am this sort of virtuous, decent, nice person, but that was the booze, that was like I
wasn't suggesting that was a good answer.
Someone who had taken me over. What I'm suggesting is that we're always a combination of all these things. And for example, when you are very nervous and you're doing an academic presentation or your PhD defense, whatever, and then you just like somebody asks you a tricky question, you don't have the answer, you take a sip of water. Now, together with the water, you come up with a decent answer, but without the water, you don't. I don't think that we should deny the agency of water in this, in that you, of course, you self-manipulate your chemical constitution so that you add a little bit of water so that the whole becomes better functional. You have this recipe from the past, it has worked. As a trace, it is in you, it suggests, well, this might be a good thing to do at the moment. But without the water, you're done, you can't answer the question and so on. So that's where I would say that first of all, recognizing non-human agency, recognizing the role of non-human entities in our process is of paramount importance. And secondly, thinking that there is this sort of core me who knows the answers and who is responsible and so on is actually an irresponsible narrative to proceed with.
That's excellent. Can I follow up just 1 second on that? Because you introduced a really interesting question, which are what are the agencies that we're willing to grant reality to in our discourse? That's going to vary from discourse to discourse. Science has always been had a very strained relationship with any discussion of agency, and in the control fetishistic individualist cauldron that has predominated, it's always the only agents really were people, or perhaps animals if you were grateful enough to grant them souls. And of course, the manner in which the soul was elaborated over the years didn't only follow one path. Most paths acknowledged a host of intermediaries, and I'm talking daimons, angels, hypercosmic gods. And while that kind of way of elaborating our being in the world and the animating force, the forces that animate us, looks a little quaint and outdated now because we're not in 4th century Milan. Don't we do the same when we appeal to Fox News or Google? Are these not agents who we need to treat in much the same way that people formerly would have treated daimons and so on? So I think we can, recognizing that different discourse requires acknowledgement of different agencies, granting them agency so that one might, for example, we might have a battle against Fox News or a battle against Facebook. Now, in some sense, there's nothing real about either Fox News or Facebook. There's a bunch of people consuming media. In another sense, they are acting as agents and must be taken as agents in their own form, in their own right. So this.
Well, absolutely. This is what I'm saying. And there is even a bit more to this. When you were speaking, I think you said that the idea that only the present is real implies that things don't exist. With this, I would disagree, because if you say that the idea that only the present is real implies things don't exist, it doesn't. It implies the sentence implies a certain definition of what to exist means. I'm saying this because I've come against the same problem in the past, and how I have solved it for myself is providing a definition of to exist which satisfies myself. Doesn't need to satisfy anybody else, but it satisfies myself. To exist means to be caused and to cause according to a narrative.
Yeah, fine. I mean, to existence is surely the most disrespected verb in everyone's language. And I suggested that things exist in a domain of discourse, and you're articulating a domain of discourse. It's a very hard position to argue that things don't exist. I'm not going to get into any kind of an argument with that. Well, it's a respectable position in some discourses.
Okay. I'm not saying that things don't exist. I think they're certainly real because they cause other things, but they appear as these things only from a certain perspective. Taken from another perspective, like something infinitely small or much bigger, slower or quicker, you just don't notice these things, and you don't notice how they cause something. Sure. And to speak about, for for someone looking from such a perspective, they would say, well, what kind of climate change? Climate change, there is no climate and therefore it cannot change, and so on. So the thing here is like whether we want to discourse, or how do we find a discourse that has the most explanatory power for our purposes, that can take into account all kinds of things and so on. And yes, I absolutely think that we should grant the status of entity to Fox News, and also, for example, if there is a tribe and there is a bewitched or a cursed cave, because everybody dies who comes from that cave, the curse for that tribe is real, even though we know it's radiation, right? So for us, we just call the curse radiation, and we think that there are other ways of handling the curse than talking to the shaman. And when you explain the idea of animism to students, they first think this is ridiculous. But then when you tell them that actually you are also animists, most of you, at some point in your lives. For example, when you're starting your car, which doesn't start, it says, machine, why don't you start? You're talking to your car or a computer. Come on, let's boot up. We don't have much time here. And doesn't it say much about Westerners that we only talk to machines when we are angry with them? We never say, good job, computer, nice day, you're pretty hot now. Maybe you should, take a rest. But that would be exactly the same activity, just with a little bit of other, attitude.
Just to tack on the end, I thoroughly recommend for everyone the business of talking to everything around you, trees, the walls, not only the cat, of course you talk to the cat. Talking to things is a great way of recognizing that you're always in relation with them.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think we've got one more question on the queue. Abeba Birhane.
Yeah, sorry, part of my question has been answered, so I will drop my request.
All right. I sort of had a question too, but it was also answered in the sense, but I might just, you mentioned sort of the causal part, and then you sort of relativized it in this way. And I'm going to ask an annoying question, if I may. How do you square this with a lot of the kind of more analytic debates around metaphysics, if at all? Is this a conversation that can be had across disciplines, or is this really like something that you just get on board with and then ignore all that other stuff?
Yeah, well, I like to read analytical metaphysics, even though I don't really believe in it. I think most analytical philosophers, not all, but quite a few of them, or maybe what is taught in Analytical Philosophy 101, seems to be inherited or has inherited the mind frame of what in the Middle Ages were called realists. People who said universalia sunt realia, or that linguistic utterances, propositions, they really exist, and therefore we can make statements about them and so on. And also that, well, it was a development of the Platonic idea of ideas being, in the higher domain of existence. What I see as an illegitimate move on the part of analytical metaphysics is the postulation of saying that a proposition refers to a real self-identical fact and so on, and that this linguistic statement captures the whole of the fact. Because in a fact, because if you say something that, well, this is the fact, and now I'm going to, summarize it in one sentence, then you leave a lot of what is happening always as something that is insignificant for you, this is what, when Tony said that, can you be a good programmer without being a reductionist? I think this also applies to an analytical philosopher. You cannot be a good analytical philosopher without also being a reductionist, that you reduce things about or statements about reality very structuralistically to a message and noise, and discard the noise. And we know since the 1970s and since feminist criticism and deconstructionism that what is noise for some people may not be noise for others, and therefore discarding noise and saying that the fact has adequately been captured by a proposition is an illegitimate move. It is a good exercise for the brain and so on, but the only or those analytical philosophers whom I really like are those who are a little bit mavericks or rebels in their own tradition, who say that, well, no, you can't do this, or you should also do that, and so on. And there are quite a few. So yes, I think this dialogue or this discourse can engage meaningfully also with analytical philosophy.
Thank you, and thank you for this talk. What I'd like to do now is open this up to the general discussion, and we do have someone that I put on the queue a couple talks back. Mark McGann, if you're still with us, if you would like to launch the general discussion.
Okay, thank you. And I just to pick up, it was a question for Fred, and it will be directed primarily at Fred, though I think has broader considerations for both of the other talks as well. But I do love the Mark McGann, if you're still with us. We're very much in seance mode, and yes, I believe I still am, but I'm never sure after these conversations. So, Fred, if in some senses it's actually a very simple question, which is potentially just a recapitulation question, and that is to talk about what you mean by the soul, and just to see if I'm getting it clearly in my head. In essence, from the way you spoke, it struck me as to sort of to speak about the soul really is to respect the other, to recognize the value of the other, and the concept of soul is simply just the means by which we invest that other, or sort of annotate, as it were, that value. Is that accurately sort of encompassing, or is there something? Is it playing some other role in the landscape of the discourse you want to talk about? You're muted, Fred.
There I'm back. The channel is open again. I'm trying not to be too determinate in my discourse, obviously, here, because this is the most indeterminate discourse possible. But I'd like to draw a contrast between the way farming might have been conducted 100 years ago and the manner in which our industrialized food production works now, for example, where we have millions of newborn chicks ground up because they're no longer useful, cows, pigs, large animals that never know a friend, never have a relationship with anything you might call a farmer. And perhaps I'm being merely sentimental here, but I believe in previous farming practices and when production was much more local, involved mutual recognition between farmers and their animals. And those of you who garden know that to garden is to bring forth something in cooperation with it, and it's not industrial crop production. Anyone who's ever cared for a plant and been overjoyed when it grew knows that there's a huge difference between this and merely making conditions for a plant and then harvesting it. These are only small examples, but they give you, without saying that souls exist, you can see mutual recognition in such practices that are in danger of being lost when all opportunity for mutual recognition is removed, as in industrial food production, for example. Does that serve to draw out the point?
Certainly, yeah, it does for me. I think it's just an interesting refrain that I think is coming up through a number of it. It was certainly present in Elena's talk yesterday, and I think in Abby's today as well, and Rein's, that how to manage the coupling really is the question, but then to it's sort of, it has to be of the right form, or there are couplings that have greater or lesser forms of value, or and also then power associated with them.
Right. Anytime we have a coupling, we're engaging in relational thinking. We've got two things, and we do this. We've got body and Umwelt, we've got system and organism, an environment. We've got two things. Anytime you have two things, you've always bracketed out the third. So even our inactive cells swimming up the chemotactic gradient, where we've kept two sides of a relation as simplistic as possible, assumes that that water is entirely unproblematic and doesn't contain any waves or sharks. Relational thinking is itself a frame that we need to always be capable of stepping back from and placing within a larger discourse. In this way, relational thinking, so simplistic, I don't know what the number one is. Unity is not divisible. When we count to two and we have this relation, we need to recognize we brought that forth. So there's a third, and this seems to me to be a never-ending process. So the article I wrote recently for Frontiers started with this zoom out camera notion from Guy did the Holy Mountain. And I take that very seriously. So recognizing the intersubjective relation between a farmer and a cow, or me and a begonia, is fine, but obviously you don't want to stick at that level. Right? We need to always recognize this is embedded in, always embedded in something.
Got, I think, at least two people in the queue. So we're going to go with Eduardo Martinez first, because he's been waiting for a little while, and then turn to Rein.
All right, thanks to all the speakers for this great panel. As someone who is kind of a bit outside the literature you all have been engaging with, I wanted to raise a question that I think is most centrally responding to Abeba Birhane's talk, but I think kind of reflects some of what I've learned from all three talks. So I'm wondering about heterogeneity amongst different techno-rationalist perspectives, if there is a kind of a lot of different differences between what that looks like, different ways of seeing through that framework, and then whether moving between those different perspectives can be more or less epistemically or politically fruitful. So the way I'm coming from this is I'm thinking of, for example, if anyone's familiar with James C. Scott, who's kind of a political scientist and anthropologist, wrote an influential book called Seeing Like a State, where he kind of goes through the history of the development of different nation states and argues that states take on a particular way of seeing in the world. They pick up certain kinds of evidence, miss other kinds, and for that reason, they try to impose certain kinds of evidence gathering to make society legible to them and be able to control the population. So that's the reason why you have a census, you have tax information collected, so you can then tax the population, you can impose regulations, et cetera. And it seems like there's a distinctive way the state might see, it might be techno-rationalist in the same sense that you've all been describing, but it might be a different kind of techno-rationalism than the kind of perspective that Alphabet sees through or that Facebook sees through. And there might also be people who kind of shift between these perspectives. Someone who's has a bureaucratic job might be very critical of the way that the state sees things, but still kind of contributes and kind of looks through the state's eyes in different ways. And it seems like that kind of perspectival shifting is also kind of a much more general phenomenon, given some of the other talks, just how we've talked about kind of ways of seeing time, and scientific framework can be perspectival. Also thinking about the way our cognitive apparatuses can affect what is legible to us as compared to like what might be legible from the perspective of a mountain. And so it seems like there's a kind of more general argument being put forth here about the epistemic value of shifting between perspectives. I wonder if that also has political import, given the different kind of techno-rationalist frameworks, if there is that heterogeneity.
Yeah, so if I can translate your question into the current debates in AI ethics, broadly speaking, I know Fred would very much oppose the use of ethics in that context. Yeah, so you have people, for example, on the one hand, opposing to, say, for example, face recognition systems, opposing their use because they recognize, different people, like based on skin pigmentation, for example. The darker you are, the less accurately you are recognized, whatever accurate means in that context. So in that case, one approach is to make that system, to create a more accurate system that recognizes everybody with similar accuracy. So maybe that's one aspect of techno-rationalism. But on the other hand, you have people entirely opposing the very idea of face recognition systems. What even is the point of improving them if that face recognition system is going to be used to surveil people, to almost a lot of these systems are, in a sense, created and sold and designed to almost play a gacha, to catch people doing the wrong things rather than to help people or to create a more equitable world. So another techno-rationalist framing, if that's what you would call different perspectivals or different domains of techno-rationalism. So one might be, making them more accurate, making them work equally at the same level for everyone. But another might be scrapping them all together, because at the end of the day, whether they are accurate or not, they are going to end up being used for malicious purposes. But another perspectival or another approach might be to have those systems still, to create them in a way that work for everybody, maybe change the objective, instead of, say, using them to implementing them in the environment to surveil people, or to instead of using them in the prison system or whatever, use them in a way that, say, for example, help homeless people or help. I'm very skeptical about how face recognition can be used in a way that helps vulnerable people. But one approach might be to shift the objective, to shift what they do, and use them, in a much more positive manner to facilitate and to rehabilitate people, as opposed to, playing a gacha. So I don't know if that I'm translating it in a kind of in a discourse that I'm familiar with. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very helpful. Part of what I'm getting out of that, I take it, is that if you have that view where there might be ways of leveraging some of the technological advancements in ways that fit with other kind of value frameworks that maybe are more kind of liberatory, then you might still see some epistemic value in having been able to inhabit that perspective of seeing things the way Google sees them right now, even if you reject the aims they have. So thank you.
Rein, do you still have a question?
Yes. Well, actually, it was a follow-up to Marek's and Fred's exchange, but I think it relates also to what Eduardo and Abeba were talking about, in that when Fred was speaking about mutual recognition and a sort of a relationship emerging between, like, a farmer and the animals, or a gardener and the plants, and so, well, I would rather put it the other way around, that the farmer emerges and the gardener emerges out of the relationship with the plants, and that the mutual recognition is not something that is produced, but it's something that produces. And mutual recognition is precisely the opposite of the techno-rational attitude to things, where we bracket them into categories and we label them, and we say, well, face recognition, and then we say what a face is, and we exclude certain people, precisely because we already know that, and therefore it is the relationship here that is produced, and what we would rather need is a relationship that produces us and the other, and keeps us in contact, rather than something that separates, brackets, labels, and so on. But yes, well, initially I was just suggesting that we would perhaps want to turn this around, but I think it applies to the techno-rational point as well.
I think that's lovely, and I think you're dead right that the farmer is as much produced as the cow. And you can take that and put it right into the realm of self-driving cars. Our government at the moment has a call out for public contributions because they're considering what it is to have autonomous driving vehicles on the road. And I contributed yesterday, and what I said was, don't believe that this car is autonomous. Don't believe that this car can perceive. What this car is a machine that can make certain discriminations, and so therefore it can only see the kind of things that it can see. In other words, to create a self-driving car, you must create a world for a self-driving car, that no self-driving car can exist without the appropriate world. And to unleash this into the human space is then to sacrifice the human space in favor of the self-driving car. So these rather profound and embodied considerations are not necessarily irrelevant when we come to a very concrete discussion, and self-driving cars are a good one, where the manner in which we speak of it, the predicates that we employ of it, have serious consequences for the degree to which we granted permission over our lives.
Yes, well, next to the place where I live, is a street where a self-driving car regularly passes, and there is a sign saying, "Attention, a self-driving car." And then one of the a beautiful picture was of an elderly gentleman with a walking stick at the sign, who was photographed, so that when you look at the photograph, you look at this elderly gentleman trying to cross the road. It says, "Attention, this is a self-driving car, a human being." So yes, this is, I completely agree with you. Well, Simone Weil has this wonderful fiery pamphlet out of the 1930s, where she says that technology can be an extension of human being, like an axe is an extension of the hand, but technology can also impose other regimes of being onto humans. And at this point, we could say that technology has become another to us, and someone who is hostile to us, who forces us to adopt, for example, postures or ways to sit or ways to do things that we wouldn't normally do.
I'm a little concerned about casting technology as if technology simply existed. One technology I'm very concerned with is writing, the marks that we make, and they completely changed us and they become us in some sense. A chair is technology that enforces a particular way of sitting. I don't know if you want to call it enforcing a particular way of sitting. There are societies without chairs, and people do sit differently in societies without chairs. There's no doubt about it. But we sort of come to accept our chairs. And how much further can we go? Well, on an evolutionary scale, these were technologies, these digits that grew here somewhere. And the opposable thumb, holy cow, was that a technology? That was a great one. It gave us streets up, put us so far ahead of the brute beasts. We're continuing to do this. So technology should not be seen as something that's separate from us. Technology is our enfolding in the world. It's part of the dung beetle, if you will. We don't live without technology, just as a dung beetle doesn't live without dung, but it's also dung.
I
agree. Yeah.
I also absolutely agree, but I want to add, yes, technology is not, something above and beyond, we are, or humans, whatever we is. It's something we create, and it's also something that helps create a certain type of future. But in these statements and in these claims, what's often missing is that a closer look at we, yeah, we create it and we live in it, and it helps create a certain type of future, but it's not that we is equally responsible for creating technology. There is, power asymmetries, there is disparities, certain type of a small group of people in society, as I mentioned earlier, often, privileged elite white men are often responsible and in charge of creating a certain type of technology, therefore creating a certain type of future. Whereas on the other hand, if we look at power asymmetries or societal hierarchies, in a hierarchical manner, what we find is like the lower you are, the more you are at the bottom of these societal hierarchies, these ladders of privilege, the less say we have in what kind of technology is created and in what kind of future is brought forth. So it's these are the things that often get lost, and within these kind of technology is a tool that we create debate. And honestly, I'm going to brush the the embodied and the inactive and even like even the complex crowd in one brush, and I'll run away after that so you don't catch me. But within these very broad perspectives, even though I am attached to it, even though I lean on it for my work, what is often really missing is acknowledgement of these power disparities, these societal hierarchies, the fact that the social world as it is, gives certain people, depending on their position, race, ethnicity, gender, blah, blah, it gives certain privilege, it gives a certain advantage to some, while it creates obstacles to others. So as we talk about, we humans and we creating technology, it's just, So my point is, as great as these very broad, embodied inactive systems perspectives are, if we can again simplify and put it against, the computational kind of thinking of, humans, these perspectives are great, but they often miss to acknowledge these social norms and systems of hierarchy. And that's what I wanted to add.
Thank you. That's a very wonderful note to close this session on. Of course, everyone is invited to stay and chat in a more informal capacity, but before we do that, let us thank our speakers for their wonderful talks. Thank you to all of you for coming and, just contributing so much to this discussion.
So I had a question that sort of followed. I think the way we ended was perfect. But I had a sort of a question that I might have a hidden answer to, but I'm curious. And I come from the Hawaii School of Writing, which means that anytime a pun can come into existence, I have to put it in italics and make sure everyone knows that it's important. But talking a little bit about what's next in terms of the theme of the conference, something that's emerged between panel 1 and panel 2 is, I remember we've had a few talks trying to promote social ontologies or relationality. And there was a really amazing response from Quill in the first panel, which they were saying, yeah, we get that. There is sort of the rationalist Cartesian tradition, but the majority of us have this relational perspective. It is they who are in the exception, and we who have these perspectives. So coming in and arguing about those, we should say, sure, but what's next? What do we do? And something that came up in this panel, which specifically was shifting away from the Cartesian cognitivist, who seems to have been, they're the group that is, we've already kind of moved past with our social ontologies and ideas. And we have this techno-rationalist Cartesian, or the techno-Cartesian, or, the Gibsonian. I don't mean Gibson, I mean, from Neuromancer was mentioned yesterday, this sort of like this version of the Cartesian opponent. I was wondering if you had reflections on if this should be what our work is about, because I'm tired of, even following Tony and responding to people who are just not going to read my work. The cognitivist who has a cognitive science unit is not going to take me as a postdoc because I say the 4E stuff. Can I just ignore them and make a new target? Is that a more practical form of like use of my time? Because I don't know that I need to be debating with those like that tradition. If we've already replaced them or we've already moved past them into these relational ways, should we be targeting this sort of techno problem? Because like you were talking about, Abeba, like this is an extremely important thing that most of us academics are just ignoring because we like to engage with cognitive science in the abstract. Should we follow you away from cognitive science as such into the real world?
Could we stop blaming Descartes for everything? The guy was a genius and he was of his time, and everything gets terribly, terribly simplified when we say Descartes computationalism technology. That just does not work. All humans at all times have both had intellect and bodies, and these perspectives need to be acknowledged. They see things with their own eyes. Can't blame that on Descartes. And they have bodies that don't fully account for that. You can't say that David Hume sorted all that out either. So I just don't like having Descartes as the whipping boy here, because we need to acknowledge our intellectual being, nous, the higher and the lower, as well as the our embodied constitution.
Yeah, that makes sense. I remember writing a paper about Descartes, Cartesian intersubjectivity, and then failing my first qualifying exam because I tried to save Descartes. So I'm not allowed to do that. I was taught to hate him. I'm sorry.
He's dead now. You're all right.
Wondering if Elmo is still here, because Elmo and Fred had a moment in the chat about dialogical realism, and I thought that was really interesting about negotiating boundaries. And I'm wondering if this connects to some of the things that you're saying, Jonathan, in terms of like practical directions, because when you talk about negotiating boundaries, well, we can talk about technology when you talk about negotiating boundaries, and we can talk about a lot of things. And I don't know if Elmo wants to say anything, if he's around.
Yeah, I'm here. I was just trying to express what I thought Fred had said as a clarification of dialogical realism, and I'm not sure whether I projected too much, whether I was projecting or whether I was actually understanding what Fred said. But I thought his point was very good, that everyone who says that they're a realist are a realist about like some specific set of things and not others. So there's always an implicit boundary. If you ask any philosopher who has a job and says that they are a realist, whether they believe in ghosts, the vast majority will say no, they don't think that ghosts are real. So they're realist about just specifically all the right things that actually exist. But of course, it doesn't tell you like everyone is a realist in that sense. But what I think differentiates maybe the notion of dialogical realism is the idea that having this set, defining the set of things that exists, or like drawing this boundary between what is real and what isn't something that you should do as a matter of your private faith in secret, and then people have to try really hard to talk to you for a long time to find out what you actually believe. But instead maybe it's more useful if you want to do something with other people, like having a conversation or even achieving something, that you just have to come to some sort of understanding about what you are going to mean by real, and then you can just take it from there and get whatever it is you're trying to do together done.
Yeah. I seem to have struck a nerve with this techno-rationalist word, which I didn't mean to start anything with that. I've never written it or leaned on it in any sense, but I have started to try to characterize a contemporary secular scientific mentality as being those who are sure who, what, where they are. And I want to characterize my own position as always being somewhat unsure, and always being a matter of trying to find out who, what, where I am. And so doubt comes into the picture. And when there's doubt, one always needs to be adjusting one's position. One always needs to be responsive. So I doubt, therefore I dance might be perhaps a better riposte to Descartes. See you, Abby. Take care.
Love it, especially it reminds me of the meme where you have the first panel, which is the sort of like dumb brain, and the middle panel is like, oh, it's getting a little smarter, and the final brain is like, oh, I see the whole universe clearly. So you have, mind body dualism. Oh, okay, you see that you have a phone and it's separate from you, congrats. And then you have the sort of anti-dualist. It's like, no, me and the phone, we're relational, and that's the middle panel. And what Fred is saying, hold on, get to panel 3, invite Dogen, or someone, this like non-dualism, which is like, actually dualism's fine. You need to strawman someone to make your career look useful. Like in reality, it's really messy. And it reminds me, I wonder if you comment on this, there's an article that just came out, which is the sort of comparative philosopher versus the sort of Western chauvinist philosopher, which I'm of course strawmanning them because they're jerks, typically white supremacists, and I don't like them. And they're basically saying, you can't cancel Aristotle. The Western civilization is the best. Y'all are jerks. Whereas the comparative person is trying to say, actually, history has been relational all the way down. You can still love Western philosophy. You just can't say Western philosophy at the exclusion of the world that they're in, which has involved non-Western ideas, whatever all those things mean, all the way down. So I wonder if there's just like getting it, like untangling that history as a part of this process.
You can't appeal to history. You cannot appeal. History is built from the present towards the past. So I have this fantasy of seeing Charles Darwin and Jeremy Button in a boat in the Atlantic discussing the matter of history. Charles Darwin doesn't know what he's about to do, and he's actually there as a beetle collector. And Jeremy Button is the main reason this journey is in existence, which was because he was kidnapped from Tierra del Fuego on a previous voyage, and he's now being returned, having been civilized. I'd like those two to discuss history. You can't just appeal to history and assume to start with Aristotle. Oh, history, man.
It's like I can't remember who it was said it to me recently. It's like all this revisionist history shit. I mean, how can they be changing history? Until someone else pointed out, it's like, that is literally the profession of historians. That is their one job, is to change history on a continuous basis.
People confuse history with their past, as if their past were determinate and knowable. And it's best to back out of such discussion. Sorry, Tenor.
This is where I wonder whether or not the analytic discussions ultimately will just cleave away from what we're trying to do here, because I think that what we're talking about when we talk about, say, dialogical realism or history, we're talking about dialectic, which is like this wanting to take into account history, right? Wanting to take into account situatedness, and that is hard. It's sort of the opposite method of analytic stuff, because analytic is like, I need to like just define my blinders and then block everything else out. And usually the thing that's most consistently blocked out is going to be like history and position and context. And so that's the part where, I do wonder if it is worthwhile to just say, we don't have to convince it's a point of frustration. I'm not sure like what to go forward on in that regard. And I thought Rein's comments were helpful about analytic metaphysics, but maybe you have more thoughts.
Well, it's the Max Planck quote, isn't it? He was specifically talking about science, but it really goes for any domain of professional activity. It's like no scientific truth triumphs by bringing its opponents to the light and convincing them, but rather its opponents eventually die, and a new generation of people come along who are already familiar with the alternative point of view. It's science advances by a series of funerals, and I suspect philosophy is much the same.
I've spent everything I've talked about today has been looking backwards. It's always been looking about how did we get here, and I've resolutely refused to look forward. But you know what? This is only the beginning of everything that's going to happen. The idea that we're at the end of civilization, or that we're near the apocalypse or something like that, is, I see no reason for that. We got mathematics. That was brilliant. Analytic philosophers have used that kind of logical reasoning in a particular way. Perhaps there's some new stuff that we could use. I believe there actually is, and I'm just going to excuse myself on a totally mad promissory note. which is that the formalism of George Spencer Brown, the laws of form, which Varela used in his characterization of autopoiesis, actually provides a tool by which the certainty of analytic and mathematical reasoning can be brought into a dialogical framework, can be made to work for situated, embodied dialogue with exactly the precision that we expect of mathematics. I believe that to be the case, but that is a promissory note because no one's quite figured out what laws of form is all about. But after about 5 years of wrestling with it, I believe this is where it's going. So I recommend it to you. Okay, listen, folks, I gotta go.
Guys, yeah, I'm gonna have to run off. So
thank you so much for sticking
thanks
around.
a million. I can't make this evening. Well, what is this evening for me? But which I am very upset about. But thanks very much, and I'm very grateful that everything's online as well.
It's been brilliant, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you for coming, and we'll record it. So we'll make it available.